Have you ever felt like, no matter how deeply you care, no one seems to love you the same way back? Like you give your time, your attention, your energy, and somehow it still feels incomplete? You show up for people. You listen. You understand. You forgive. You stay, even when it hurts. But deep inside, there's this quiet emptiness. A question that keeps repeating itself. Why doesn't anyone truly love me? And maybe you've tried to fix it. Tried to be better. Kinder. More patient. Less emotional. Less needy. Less you. Thinking that maybe, if you just adjust a little more, someone will finally see your worth. But instead, you feel overlooked. Taken for granted. Like people come close, but never close enough. And the painful part is, they don't even realize it. They don't see what you feel. They don't understand what you give. And slowly, you start questioning yourself. Am I asking for too much? Am I too much? Why is it so easy for others to be loved, but not me? And that's where it begins. Not the loneliness, but the confusion. Because it doesn't make sense. You know how deeply you can love. You know how much you can give. So why does it feel like you're the only one doing it? Why does love feel like something you have to earn? Something you have to hold on to tightly before it slips away? And the more you try to hold it, the more fragile it becomes. The more distant people seem. The more uncertain everything feels. Until one day, you're left wondering if real love even exists for you. But what if the problem isn't that people don't love you? What if there's something deeper happening? Something subtle. Something you've never been taught to see? Because until you understand it, you'll keep experiencing the same pattern. Different faces. Different names. Same feeling. And it doesn't change. Until you do. Before anything else. You need to hear this clearly. There is nothing wrong with you. Not with the way you love. Not with the way you feel. Not with the depth of your emotions. You are not too much. You are not too sensitive. You are not hard to love. In fact, the very things you question about yourself are often the same things that make you capable of loving so deeply. But somewhere along the way, you were taught something without realizing it. You were taught that love is something you have to earn. Not directly. Not in words. But through experiences. Through the way people responded to you. Through the way affection was given or withheld. Maybe love came with conditions. Maybe it came when you behaved a certain way. When you stayed quiet. When you were understanding. When you didn't ask for too much. And slowly, without even noticing, you started adapting. You started shaping yourself into someone who could be loved. You learned to give more. To be patient. To tolerate things that didn't feel right. Because deep down, you believed that if you just did enough, someone would finally stay. Someone would finally choose you completely. And that belief followed you. Into every connection. Into every relationship. Into every moment where your heart was involved. But here's the part no one explains. When love becomes something you try to earn, it stops feeling natural. It becomes effort. It becomes pressure. It becomes something you constantly have to maintain. And that's exhausting. Because now, you're not just loving someone. You're managing the connection. Watching their reactions. Analyzing their behavior. Trying to make sure everything stays okay. And when something feels off, You don't feel safe. You feel anxious. You feel uncertain. You feel like you need to do something to fix it. So you give more. You try harder. You show up even stronger. But instead of bringing you closer, it often creates distance. And that's the confusing part. Because your intention is pure. You're not trying to control. You're trying to care. You're trying to hold on to something meaningful. But the way it shows up feels like pressure to the other person. Not because you're wrong, but because the energy behind it carries fear. Fear of losing. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being left. And people can feel that. Even if they can't explain it. Even if you never say it out loud. Because emotions don't need words to be understood. They're felt. In tone. In behavior. In subtle actions. So when you come from a place of needing love, it changes the dynamic. It shifts the balance. Without you even realizing it. And again, this is not your fault. You didn't choose this pattern consciously. You learned it. You adapted to it. You survived with it. Because at some point, it worked. It helped you feel connected. It helped you feel safe. But now, it's creating the opposite effect. And that's why it feels so frustrating. Because you're doing what you believe is right. But getting results that feel wrong. And over time, that creates doubt. Not just about others, but about yourself. You start questioning your worth. Your value. Your ability to be loved. And that question quietly shapes your entire experience. Because when you begin to doubt your worth, you start accepting less than you deserve. Not intentionally, but gradually. You tolerate inconsistency. You excuse behavior. You ignore red flags. Because a part of you believes something is better than nothing. And that belief keeps you stuck in cycles that don't fulfill you. Cycles where you give more than you receive. Where you wait more than you should. Where you hope things will change. Instead of recognizing what already is. And the hardest part? You don't even realize you're doing it. Because it feels normal. It feels familiar. It feels like love. But love is not supposed to feel like constant effort. It's not supposed to feel like uncertainty. It's not supposed to feel like you're trying to prove your place in someone's life. Real love doesn't require you to shrink yourself. Or silence your needs. Or question your worth. Real love feels different. It feels stable. It feels calm. It feels safe. Not perfect. But secure. And if you haven't experienced that yet, it doesn't mean you never will. It simply means there's something important that you haven't fully understood yet. And once you do, everything begins to shift. Not because you force it, but because you finally see what was always there. And that awareness is where real change begins. Most people believe the problem is simple. They think, I just haven't found the right person yet. Or, the timing wasn't right. Or maybe, they just didn't realize my value. And on the surface, that feels true. Because it's easier to believe that love is something external. Something you find. Something that either works or doesn't. But what if the real issue isn't who you're meeting, but how you're experiencing love itself? Because here's something most people don't realize. Love doesn't begin when someone chooses you. It begins long before that. It begins in the way you see yourself. In the way you feel about your own worth. In the quiet, internal beliefs you carry. Even when no one else is around. And those beliefs shape everything. They influence how you show up, how you respond, what you tolerate, what you accept, and most importantly, what you expect. Because expectations don't just live in your mind. They live in your energy. If deep down you expect inconsistency, you'll find yourself in inconsistent situations. If you expect to be unsure, you'll attract uncertainty. Not because you want it, but because it feels familiar. Because your mind is always trying to recreate what it already knows, even if what it knows doesn't feel good. So when you enter a connection, you're not starting from zero. You're bringing a whole internal world with you. A world shaped by past experiences, past disappointments, past patterns. And without realizing it, you begin to act from that world. You might overgive because you're afraid of losing. You might stay quiet because you don't want to create conflict. You might accept less because a part of you feels that's all you can get. And all of this happens subtly, quietly, almost invisibly. But the other person feels it. They feel how much space you give them. They feel how much you bend. They feel how much you tolerate. And without meaning to, you begin to teach them how to treat you. Not with words, but with behavior. Because people respond to patterns. If you always make yourself available, they don't feel urgency. If you always forgive without boundaries, they don't feel consequences. If you always give without receiving, they don't learn to give back. And this is where things start to shift. Because the problem isn't that people don't care. It's that the dynamic you create doesn't require them to show up differently. And again, this is not about blame. It's about awareness. Because once you see it, you realize something powerful. You are not just experiencing love. You are shaping it. Through your expectations. Through your boundaries. Through your self-perception. But most people never pause to see this. Instead, they try to fix things externally. They try to communicate more. Explain more. Give more. Thinking that if they just do enough, the other person will change. But here's the truth. You cannot create a stable connection from an unstable internal state. If you feel unsure of your worth, no amount of external reassurance will feel enough. If you feel like love can be taken away, you'll constantly look for signs of it disappearing. If you feel like you have to earn your place, you'll keep trying to prove yourself. And all of that creates pressure. Not just for you, but for the connection itself. Because love cannot grow where there is constant fear. It cannot deepen where there is constant doubt. It cannot feel safe where there is constant tension. And this is the shift most people need to make. From focusing on the other person to understanding their own internal state. Because when you change that, everything else begins to follow. Not instantly, but naturally. You stop overgiving. You stop over-explaining. You stop trying to secure something that should feel secure on its own. And instead, you begin to observe. You begin to choose. You begin to respond instead of react. And that changes the entire dynamic. Because now, you're no longer coming from need. You're coming from awareness. And awareness is where real change begins. So the problem isn't that love is unavailable to you. The problem is that the way you've been approaching it has been rooted in patterns that quietly push it away. And once you see that clearly, you don't feel powerless anymore. You feel responsible. Not in a heavy way, but in an empowering way. Because now, you realize something important. If you've been unconsciously creating these patterns, you can also change them. And that's where everything begins to shift. There is a deeper law operating beneath every relationship you experience. A principle so subtle that most people go their entire lives without fully recognizing it. And yet, it shapes who you attract, how people treat you, and how love unfolds in your life. This law is simple. People respond to your self-concept more than your effort. Not just what you say about yourself, but what you truly believe about yourself. At a deeper level. A quieter level. A level that operates beneath conscious thought. This is what teachings inspired by Joseph Murphy point toward again and again. Your subconscious mind holds a blueprint. A blueprint of who you think you are. What you believe you deserve. And what you expect from others. And this blueprint doesn't stay inside you. It expresses itself outwardly. Through your tone. Through your reactions. Through your boundaries. Through the way you carry yourself in subtle, almost invisible ways. If your internal belief is, I am worthy of consistent, respectful love, you will naturally behave in ways that reflect that. You won't chase. You won't over-explain. You won't tolerate confusion for too long. Not because you're trying to be strong, but because it feels natural to you. But if your internal belief is, I might not be enough. I could be left. I need to hold on to this. Then your behavior shifts. You become more accommodating. More flexible. More willing to ignore what doesn't feel right. Not because you lack strength, but because your internal state is seeking security. And this is where the law becomes clear. Your external relationships mirror your internal beliefs. Not perfectly. Not instantly. But consistently. Because your subconscious mind is always working to create alignment between what you believe and what you experience. Even if those beliefs are limiting. Even if they create pain. It doesn't judge. It simply reflects. This is why two people can enter similar relationships and have completely different experiences. One feels secure. The other feels anxious. One feels chosen. The other feels uncertain. And it's not always about the partner. It's about the internal state each person brings into the connection. Because that state determines everything. How you interpret actions. How you respond to situations. How long you stay in something that doesn't serve you. And most importantly, what you believe is normal. If inconsistency feels normal, you'll tolerate it. If emotional distance feels familiar, you won't question it immediately. If effort feels like something you have to constantly give, you'll keep giving. Because your mind is always trying to stay within what feels known. Even if known doesn't feel good. And this is why change feels uncomfortable at first. Because when you start shifting your self-concept, you're stepping outside of what your mind is used to. You're creating a new internal standard. A new expectation. A new way of seeing yourself. And at first, that can feel unfamiliar. Even unnatural. But this is where real transformation begins. Because once your internal belief changes, your behavior changes without force. You no longer have to remind yourself to set boundaries. You naturally do it. You no longer have to convince yourself to walk away from what feels wrong. You simply can't stay there. Because it no longer matches who you believe you are. And this is the key. You don't attract what you want. You attract what you feel you are. What you feel you deserve. What you feel is normal for you. So if you want to experience deeper love, more consistent love, more stable love, The shift doesn't begin with finding someone better. It begins with becoming someone who expects better. Not from a place of ego. Not from a place of superiority. But from a place of self-recognition. A quiet understanding that says, I no longer accept what doesn't align with my worth. And when that belief becomes real for you, not just intellectually, but emotionally, everything around you begins to reorganize. People respond differently. Connections feel different. Decisions become clearer. Because now, you are no longer negotiating your value. You are embodying it. And that changes the entire experience of love. Not because you control others, but because you have finally aligned with yourself. And once that alignment is established, you don't have to chase love anymore. You don't have to convince anyone. You don't have to prove your worth. Because the way you see yourself quietly teaches the world how to see you too. This is the moment where everything becomes clear. Not complicated. Not abstract. Just clear. No one will truly love you until you understand how to love yourself at the level you expect from others. Not the version of self-love that sounds good in theory. Not temporary confidence. Not pretending to be strong. But a deep, stable, internal sense of worth. A quiet knowing that does not depend on someone else's attention, or approval, or presence. Because as long as you rely on someone else to confirm your value, love will always feel uncertain. It will feel like something that can be given or taken away. Something you have to protect. Something you have to maintain. And that creates fear. Even in moments that should feel peaceful. Because when your sense of worth depends on another person, you are constantly watching. Constantly analyzing. Constantly trying to make sure everything stays okay. But love doesn't grow in that environment. It doesn't deepen under pressure. It doesn't become stable when it's being monitored. It becomes fragile. Because it's being used to fill something that only you can fill. And this is where the shift happens. When you stop asking, do they love me enough? And start asking, do I feel whole within myself? Because that question changes your entire experience. It moves your focus inward, where real stability begins. And once you begin building that internal stability, something powerful happens. You stop chasing reassurance. You stop needing constant validation. You stop reacting to every small change. Because your sense of self is no longer tied to someone else's behavior. And in that space, love becomes lighter, calmer, more natural. Because now, you're not using it to complete yourself. You're sharing it from a place of completeness. And that difference is everything. Because when you love from need, you hold tightly. You fear loss. You try to control outcomes. But when you love from wholeness, you allow space. You trust the connection. You remain grounded. Even when things are uncertain. And people feel that difference. They respond to it. Not because you're trying to impress them, but because your energy is different. There is no pressure. No silent expectation. No hidden fear. Just presence. Just calm. Just certainty. And that creates safety. Not just for you, but for them. Because now the connection doesn't feel like something they have to manage. It feels like something they can naturally be part of. And this is why self-love is not selfish. It's foundational. It determines how you experience everything, including love. Because the way you see yourself becomes the lens through which you see others. If you feel incomplete, you will look for someone to complete you. If you feel unsure, You will look for someone to reassure you. If you feel unworthy, you will look for someone to prove you wrong. But if you feel whole, you don't look for completion. You recognize connection. You don't chase reassurance. You feel stable within yourself. You don't need someone to prove your worth. You already know it. And from that place, love becomes something entirely different. It becomes mutual, balanced, stable. Because now, you're no longer giving from emptiness. You're giving from fullness. And that changes what you accept, what you tolerate, what you allow into your life. You no longer settle for inconsistency. You no longer justify confusion. You no longer stay where your value is not recognized. Not because you're trying to be strong, but because it simply doesn't align with who you are anymore. And this is the truth most people spend years trying to understand. You cannot receive consistent love if you feel inconsistent within yourself. You cannot feel secure in a connection if you don't feel secure within your own identity. You cannot experience deep love if you are still questioning your own worth. So the solution is not to find someone who loves you more. It's to become someone who no longer doubts their own value. Because when that shift happens, you stop asking for love, and you start allowing it. You stop chasing connection, and you start recognizing it. You stop needing someone to choose you, because you have already chosen yourself. And that is the moment everything changes. Not just in how others see you, but in how you experience love itself. There's a pattern that becomes very clear once you begin to understand this principle. It shows up in different people, different situations, different types of relationships. But the core shift is always the same. When the internal state changes, the external experience follows. There was a woman who had always felt like she had to fight for love. In every relationship, she was the one giving more, checking in more, trying harder. She believed that if she just showed enough care, if she proved her loyalty, if she stayed patient, the other person would eventually meet her at the same level. But that moment never came. Instead, she felt drained, unseen, like she was pouring into something that never filled her back. And the more she gave, the more distant the other person became. At first, she thought she was just choosing the wrong people. But over time, she noticed something deeper. The pattern was repeating. Different faces. Same feeling. So instead of looking outward, she turned inward. She began to notice how often she ignored her own needs. How quickly she made excuses for others. How easily she accepted less than what she truly wanted. And for the first time, she made a quiet decision. I'm not going to chase love anymore. Not in a dramatic way. Not with anger. But with awareness. She stopped overtexting. Stopped trying to fix every emotional gap. Stopped making herself available all the time. She didn't withdraw love. She just stopped abandoning herself. At first, it felt uncomfortable. Even scary. Because she wasn't used to holding that space. But slowly, something shifted. The next connection she entered felt different. Not because the person was magically perfect, but because she was different. She no longer tolerated inconsistency. She no longer chased clarity. She expected it. And for the first time, she experienced a relationship that felt balanced. Not forced. Not one-sided. Just natural. There was also a man who believed he had to impress people to be valued. In relationships, he would constantly try to prove himself. Through attention. Through effort. Through always being available. At first, it worked. People were drawn to him. But over time,
the dynamic would change.
the same people who were once interested would become distant, less responsive, less engaged.
And he never understood why.
Until he realized something important. He wasn't being himself. He was performing. Trying to maintain an image. Trying to secure approval. And that created pressure. So he made a shift. He stopped trying to impress. Stopped over-explaining. Stopped seeking validation through constant effort. Instead, he focused on how he felt about himself. He started valuing his own time, his own presence, his own energy. And that changed how he showed up. He became calmer, less reactive, more grounded. And without trying,
People began to respond differently.
with more respect, more consistency, more genuine interest. Because now, he wasn't asking to be valued. He was embodying value. Another story. Someone who had a deep fear of being alone. So they stayed in relationships that didn't feel right. Ignored red flags. Accepted behavior that hurt them.
All because leaving felt worse than staying. Because being alone felt like failure.
But one day,
They reached a point where staying became more painful than leaving.
and they made a decision. Not out of confidence, but out of honesty. They chose themselves. And for a while, it felt empty, quiet, unfamiliar. But in that space,
They began to reconnect with themselves.
to understand their needs, their boundaries, their worth. And over time, that fear of being alone started to fade. Because they no longer felt incomplete on their own. And when they entered their next relationship, everything changed. They didn't tolerate what they once accepted.
They didn't chase what they once feared losing. They simply observed,
Chose.
and allowed the connection to unfold naturally.
And because of that, they experienced something they never had before.
A relationship that felt safe.
Stable. Mutual. These stories are not exceptions.
They are examples of a pattern.
A pattern that becomes visible once you understand the principle behind it. It's not about becoming someone else. It's not about playing games. It's not about acting distant or pretending not to care.
It's about shifting your internal state.
From needing love
To being whole within yourself.
Because when that shift happens, you don't just experience different relationships. You experience yourself differently within them. You feel calmer, more secure, less reactive, more aware. And that changes everything. Because now, you're not trying to hold on to love. You're allowing it to meet you. And when love meets someone who is already whole, it doesn't feel like effort. It feels like alignment. Now the question becomes simple. How do you actually live this? Not just understand it, but apply it in your everyday life? Because awareness without action changes nothing.
So this is where the real shift begins.
Not in big, dramatic steps,
But in small, consistent changes.
the first step is awareness. Start noticing your patterns. Not judging them. Just observing. When do you feel the urge to chase? When do you feel anxious in a connection? When do you start overthinking? When do you feel like you need to do something to keep someone? These moments are important.
Because they show you where your old patterns are still active.
Instead of reacting immediately, pause. Even for a few seconds.
That pause breaks the automatic cycle.
And in that space, ask yourself, am I acting from self-respect or from fear? Be honest. Because that answer will guide everything. If it's coming from fear, don't act on it. Not immediately. Let the emotion settle. Because actions taken from fear usually create more fear. The second step is learning to sit with discomfort. This is where most people struggle. Because when you stop chasing, it feels unnatural. It feels like you're doing nothing. Like you're losing control. But that discomfort is not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're breaking a pattern. A pattern your mind has relied on for a long time. So instead of escaping that feeling, stay with it. Let it pass. Because it always does. And on the other side of that discomfort is clarity. The third step is boundaries. Not aggressive ones. Not walls. But clear, calm limits. Boundaries are not about controlling others. They're about honoring yourself. They're about saying, this is what I'm okay with, and this is what I'm not. Without needing to explain excessively. Without needing approval. Because when you set boundaries, you're reinforcing your self-worth. And over time, that becomes your new normal. The fourth step is shifting your internal dialogue. What you say to yourself matters. Not just occasionally, but consistently. If your internal voice says, I hope they don't leave. I hope I'm enough. I hope this works. Then your state will reflect uncertainty. Instead, begin to gently shift that voice. Not forcefully, but intentionally. Remind yourself, I am not here to be chosen. I choose. I don't chase connection. I allow it. I am already enough, with or without this person. At first, it might not feel fully true. That's okay. Because repetition builds familiarity. And familiarity builds belief. The fifth step is detachment from outcome. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop clinging. You stop trying to control how things unfold. You stop attaching your peace to a specific result. Because when you do that, you give your power away. Instead, focus on how you show up. Focus on your energy, your boundaries, your self-respect. Let the outcome be secondary. Because the right connections don't require force. They respond to alignment. And finally, the most important shift. Your identity. This is where everything comes together. Because it's not just about what you do. It's about who you become. You are no longer someone who chases love. You are someone who recognizes it. You are no longer someone who fears being alone. You are someone who feels whole on their own. You are no longer someone who tolerates confusion. You are someone who expects clarity. And this identity is built through consistent action. Through small decisions. Through moments where you choose yourself. Even when it feels uncomfortable. Because every time you do that, you reinforce a new belief. A new standard. A new version of yourself. And over time, that version becomes natural. Effortless. Real. So when you enter your next connection, you won't need to remind yourself what to do. You won't need to force confidence. You won't need to pretend. Because you've already done the work within. And that shows. In your presence. In your energy. In the way you respond to situations. You become calmer. More grounded. More certain. And that changes everything. Because now, you're not entering relationships hoping to be loved. You're entering them already knowing your worth. And from that place, love doesn't feel like something you have to fight for. It feels like something that naturally meets you. Because you are no longer chasing it. You are aligned with it. And that is the moment where love stops feeling complicated and starts feeling clear.